Final Fantasy XVI. At this early stage, the upcoming entry into this iconic franchise represents a departure from its recent trends and a return to its medieval high fantasy roots. With Final Fantasy XIV helmsman Naoki Yoshida producing and several key members of the team behind A Realm Reborn and Heavensward suspected to be involved after being quietly moved to a secret project following Heavensward, including former lead main scenario writer Kazutoyo Maihiro, the homage to Final Fantasy XIV is quite evident throughout the trailer. Inevitably, this has led to an absolute bevy of conspiracy theories swirling around social media regarding speculated connections between the world of Final Fantasy XVI and that of Final Fantasy XIV. A few to other titles as well, but particularly to Final Fantasy XIV. Some of these theories are frankly ridiculous, others a little more compelling, but I promise you, these are all theories that people are really, genuinely grabbing onto. So today, I'd like to invite you on a journey down this ethereal rabbit hole and ask that you allow me to be your tinfoil psychopomp as we brazenly and perhaps foolishly dive right in.
Our kind do not question orders, we follow them.
Tattoos. Tattoos and brandings hold significant meanings in Final Fantasy XIV, like those of the Sharlayan Archons, effectively denoting that the wearer holds some kind of magical PhD. It has been noted that these tattoos are displayed in the same place as those of some Sharlayans, and that they might represent some equivalent in earlier or pre-Sharlayan society. Do they look anything alike? No. Is this a huge stretch? Yes, absolutely. It has also been suggested that this particular tattoo is reminiscent of the Ishgardian deity Halone and her constellation, the Spear. Could Eorzea and Final Fantasy XVI share constellations and even deities? Perhaps. Shiva is a heretic to the followers of Halone in 14, and these spear-branded fellows are specifically hunting down Shiva's dominant. But it's still a stretch. Then there's this jabroni, seemingly of the same band of mercenaries, also branded with a tattoo, which seems reminiscent of the glyphs which represent the Ascians in Final Fantasy XIV, but it doesn't clearly resemble any of them in particular, nor any of the Final Fantasy XII Esper symbols upon which they were based. No doubt it's a derivative style, and it may have something to do with certain characters' abilities to channel Icons' powers in 16, without necessarily being a dominant themselves. In short, an interesting observation, but by no means a demonstration that Final Fantasy XVI takes place in the Final Fantasy XIV universe.
Come, Joshua.
Boys. This boy looks kinda like this boy from Final Fantasy XIV. Okay, yes, one of them is an elf and has a clearly established character arc in Final Fantasy XIV, but they look kinda similar. Is that anything? No, it's not. However, he also closely resembles and takes the same name and position as the son of an archduke, or duke, as is the case for this Joshua, from Vagrant Story, written by Yasumi Matsuno along with Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre. Naoki Yoshida has often cited Matsuno and his work as a significant inspiration. Matsuno was also brought onto Final Fantasy XIV as a guest writer for the Return to Ivalice storyline in Stormblood. And Joshua isn't the only suggested Vagrant Story reference in the Final Fantasy XVI trailer. This Machiavellian matron resembles one Inquisitor Heldricht. As Vagrant Story has been retconned by Matsuno to be part of the Ivalice Alliance project, set in the same world as Final Fantasy XII and Tactics, there may be a stronger argument to be made for Final Fantasy XVI being set in the original Ivalice than in any part of the Final Fantasy XIV universe. But as the Ivalice of Final Fantasy XIV has no connection to that of 12 and Tactics, despite taking a great many character names and appearances, I wouldn't assume the Joshua allusion to be anything more than homage at this point. Chocobo. The Final Fantasy XVI protagonist's Chocobo looks like a shoebill. So what, you ask? Well, bear with me. Final Fantasy XIV Ascian Emmett Selk evidently keeps a shoebill as some kind of familiar, which surreptitiously follows and spies upon the Warriors of Darkness throughout Shadowbringers. Some players go so far as to insist that Emet-Selch is the Shoebill, and that the Shoebill contains some part of the Ascian's essence even now. So the theory floating around is that this Chocobo is clearly associated with Emet-Selch, or that this is in fact Emmet himself in the form of a Chocobo, manipulating the events of the story. I promise you, I am not making this up. There's just one problem. The Chocobo is dead.
If it's the last thing I do...
Shadowbringer. The Final Fantasy XVI protagonist seems to maybe have the same English voice actor as Ardbert, a key character from Final Fantasy XIV. And here I'm going to mention a brief Shadowbringer spoiler, so if you're invested in Final Fantasy XIV and haven't yet finished 5.0, you might want to skip 30 seconds ahead. Ardbert and the Warrior of Light are shards of the same soul. The apparently canonical appearance of the Warrior of Light in each of Final Fantasy XIV's CG trailers is also identical to that of Ardbert. The one time that the Warrior of Light has had any voice in Final Fantasy XIV, we spoke with the voice of Ardbert.
This is our future. Our story.
The ubiquity of this voice, along with the Final Fantasy XVI protagonist's reasonable resemblance to Ardbert, has led many to insist that the story takes place on another shard of Hydaelyn and that he is another shard of Ardbert, or as I like to call him, Shadbert. Icons. The iconic summons of Final Fantasy are known by many epithets throughout the franchise. Espers, Eidolons, Aeons, Guardian Forces, Avatars, Astral Scions, L'Cie. Only in Final Fantasy XIV are they known as icons, specifically by the ancient Allagans and the contemporary Garleans, until now. The term icon has now been adapted to refer to the summons of Final Fantasy XVI as well. Now, of these icons, we see Shiva and Titan, but a particular focus on Phoenix and Ifrit, the latter considered a deeply subversive presence in the world of 16, where a second icon of the same element is believed impossible.
Second icon of fire? But that's impossible.
In Final Fantasy XIV, the two icons Phoenix and Ifrit are uniquely connected, having been created by the Ascian Laha Brea in ancient Amarot over 12,000 years ago. Some Final Fantasy XIV fans see them together here and cannot help but suspect Laha Brea's involvement. Then we have the method of summoning. In Final Fantasy XVI, the summoners of the icons are referred to as their dominant. It appears that they can channel the powers of their icon and in summoning provide an avatar, physically transforming themselves into their icon's form. Although this method of summoning was not previously unique to Final Fantasy XIV, it is one of the more common methods for summoning in the world of Hydaelyn. The ability of Final Fantasy XVI's protagonist to evidently channel the abilities of icons also resembles the trance techniques of summoners in Final Fantasy XIV, developed by the ancient Allagans. The theory into which these observations culminate goes a little something like this. The world of Final Fantasy XIV is composed of the Source and 13 reflections, alternate worlds occupying discrete dimensions. One of these, the 13th, suffered a cataclysmic fate around 10 or 11,000 years ago when Warriors of Light, manipulated by the Ascians, used Aura Sight to defeat and trap icons, which eventually radiated their iconic essence and corrupted the wielders, permanently transforming them into insatiable monsters, which proceeded to precipitate the flood of darkness that quickly obliterated their world. So the blind, flailing speculation is that Final Fantasy XVI takes place on the 13th shard in the years prior to the Flood of Darkness. People compulsively transforming into icons, and something vague about a blight, which would be the first symptoms of the Flood.
We cannot defend our realm from the spread of the blight.
Now, of course, there are some serious problems with this theory. Firstly, there's no mention anywhere in the trailer of the Aura Sight, nor is it being carried by storied Warriors of Light that have been evidently thwarting icons left and right. Maybe the Aura Sight is referred to as Mother Crystals in 16 rather than what Mother Crystal usually means. Maybe they are being physically carried by the dominants. And maybe young Joshua is actually a martial savant, or else inherited his crystal. But the Aura Sight in the 13th shard of Final Fantasy XIV didn't transform the wielders into avatars of the icons. It transformed them into monsters, into something more like Lucavi, which no doubt represented the first Voidsent. The Voidsent Cthulhu is actually believed to have been one of these Warriors of Light from the 13th, as suggested by the first volume of Encyclopedia Eorzea. Although the Lucavi Cuchulainn was basically an icon in the Ivalice Alliance titles, Lucavian icons have very different ontologies in 14. Secondly, despite people seeing Phoenix and Ifrit in tandem and insisting some association with Laha Breha, there's actually no evidence that Laha Breha had any role in the fall of the 13 shards. Each Ascian had a dedicated shard, and Laha Breha was mostly attached to the source. The fault of the 13th's Flood of Darkness belonged to Igeorm, whom Laha Breha subsequently kept on a short leash, but before which there is no suggestion of them having worked together in the 13th. Conspiracy theories aside, there is a lot in the Final Fantasy XVI trailer that feels reminiscent of 14. Yoshida, Takai, and much of the yet unconfirmed team are clearly Final Fantasy XIV alumni, although I should reiterate here that Yoshida is not stepping down as director and producer of 14. And much of the Matsuno projects which inspired the story and aesthetic of 14 have no doubt had the same effect here. The medieval European aesthetic and architecture is certainly evocative of Ishgard, particularly when you consider the concept art we saw at the end of 2019, which is now clearly of this project. I'm personally very curious to see how the dragon ties in. There are, of course, precedents for different Final Fantasy games being set in the same worlds, most notably the Ivalice Alliance, and Fabula Nova Crystallis, which includes the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, Type 0, and was considered to include Final Fantasy XV until the latter was diverged sometime in 2015. There are also the popular fan theories connecting Final Fantasy VII and X, supported by writer of both games Kazushige Nojima, before it was later rebuffed as a joke by co-writer Yoshinori Kitase. The non-canonical but still utterly bewildering crossover events between Final Fantasy XIV and 11, 15, Dragon Quest, Garo, and Yokai Watch doesn't really help either. So is it possible that Final Fantasy XVI is connected to 14 or the Ivalice Alliance games in more than just evocation and homage? Perhaps. I'm sure it's clear how I feel about it at this early stage, so why don't you let me know what you think in the comments below. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe and whack that notification bell into orbit if you have any interest in the lore of Final Fantasy XIV or 16, and hope to see some more coverage of 16 in the near future. I'd like to extend a huge and particular thank you to all of the channel's patrons for continuing to make my work possible. If you'd like to get on board that train for early access to videos and a plethora of behind-the-scenes goodies, you can find a link in the description below. Until next time, thank you all for watching, and take care.